Vase.
At my son's wedding, his bride threw a glass vase at my head. But just 5 minutes later, at my son's wedding, standing before 300 of Charleston's most influential guests, my new daughter-in-law picked up a 3-pound crystal vase and threw it directly at my head. The sound of it shattering against my skull was drowned out by a collective gasp from the crowd. I felt a sharp sting, then the warmth of my own blood trickling down my temple. But I wasn't afraid. In fact, I was counting on it. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. The ballroom at the Charleston Grand was a picture of Southern perfection. Golden light from a dozen chandeliers washed over tables draped in white linen, each adorned with towering arrangements of magnolias and roses. The air, thick with the scent of flowers and expensive perfume, barely stirred, heavy with the late summer humidity that clung to the city like a veil. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their melody a gentle undercurrent to the murmur of polite conversation. Everything was flawless. Everything was a lie. I watched my son, Edward, as he stood beside his bride, Clara. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow that had nothing to do with the heat. He was a prisoner in his own life, and I, his mother, had allowed his cage to be built. But tonight, I was going to tear it down. Julian, the wedding planner, gave me a subtle nod from across the room. He was a master of his craft, orchestrating the evening with an easy grace that belied the steel beneath. No one knew he was more than just an employee. No one knew he was my secret, my last line of defense, my husband's son. Taking a deep breath, I made my way to the stage. My silk dress, a deep sapphire blue, rustled softly with each step. I felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on me. The matriarch of the Ellison family expected to deliver a heartfelt, forgettable toast. They were about to get something else entirely. I took the microphone, my hand steady. My gaze swept across the room, past the curious faces, past my anxious son, and landed squarely on Clara. She smiled, a tight, triumphant little expression that didn't reach her cold eyes. She thought she had won. She thought Ellison House, our family's legacy for over a century, was finally within her grasp. She had no idea she was the centerpiece of a much larger, more intricate performance. "Good evening," I began, my voice clear and calm, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I want to thank you all for joining us to celebrate Edward and Clara." I paused, letting the pleasantries hang in the air for a moment. As a mother, you wish for your son's happiness above all else, but you also wish for his character to remain strong. I saw a flicker of annoyance in Clara's eyes. Edward shifted his weight, refusing to look at me. I continued, my words chosen as carefully as a surgeon's scalpel. "My late husband and I built our lives on a foundation of honor. It is the most valuable thing we own. Therefore, I have only one legacy to leave my son, and that is integrity." I turned my smile directly to Clara. I trust his new wife will help him uphold it. It was a direct hit, a declaration of war disguised as a blessing. Clara's mask of bridal bliss cracked. Her face flushed a deep, ugly red. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the head table. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the clink of ice in a distant glass. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her actions spoke with a violence that words never could. With a guttural cry of pure rage, she lunged for the large crystal vase in the center of the table. It was heavy, ornate, and filled with water and white roses. She hoisted it, her movements jerky and furious, and hurled it through the air. Time seemed to slow. I saw the vase spinning, catching the chandelier light in its facets. I saw the shock on Edward's face, the horror dawning on the guests. I saw Julian already moving, not towards me, but towards his assigned position. Then came the impact, a sickening crack as it struck my forehead, just above my right eye. Shards of crystal flew like shrapnel. The cold water and flower petals splashed across my face and chest, followed immediately by the warm trail of blood. The room erupted. People screamed. Chairs scraped against the floor as they jumped to their feet. But amidst the chaos, I remained perfectly still. My part was done. I had presented the bait, and she had taken it with a ferocity beyond my wildest expectations. I looked past my hysterical daughter-in-law, past my frozen son, and my eyes found Julian's again. He gave a single, sharp nod. The signal. 5 minutes. That's all we needed. 5 minutes from the moment of impact. As the hotel staff rushed towards the stage and guests swarmed forward in a panic, I simply stood my ground. A 72-year-old widow with blood on her face, watching the first phase of my plan conclude perfectly. And then, exactly 5 minutes later, every light in the ballroom went out, plunging 300 of Charleston's elite into absolute terrifying darkness. 1 week before the wedding, the trap was set. It wasn't a contraption of steel and wire, but one of porcelain teacups and polite conversation, laid out in the sun-drenched living room of Ellison House. The air, sweet with the scent of lemon oil, and the gardenias blooming just outside the open French doors, was a stark contrast to the cold ambition that had just walked through my front door. Clara swept into the room, her eyes doing a quick, dismissive inventory of the space. To her, the worn spines of the books lining the shelves weren't a history of family knowledge, but a fire hazard. The mahogany sideboard, polished to a deep shine by 4 generations of Ellison hands, was just a clunky piece of brown furniture. She saw assets and liabilities, not a home. She was a vulture dressed in Chanel, and she was circling. "Aurelia, the house is just so classic," she said, the word dripping with false sincerity. She ran a perfectly manicured finger over a porcelain figure on the mantelpiece. "It has such wonderful bones, but you must get tired of the upkeep, all this dusting." Edward trailed behind her, his gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. He looked like a boy who had been dragged to a place he didn't want to be. I poured 3 cups of iced tea, the condensation beating on the crystal glasses, and handed one to him. His fingers brushed mine, and they were cold and clammy despite the Charleston heat. "The house and I understand each other, Clara," I replied, my voice even. "We've grown old together. There's a certain comfort in that." We sat, the 3 of us, in a tense triangle. Clara took a delicate sip of her tea, then placed it on the coaster with a decisive click. The performance was over. It was time for business. "You know, Edward and I were talking the other day," she began, her tone shifting to one of practiced concern. "About the future, about legacy planning." I remained silent, letting her spin her web. "This is such a significant property," she continued, gesturing vaguely towards the sprawling lawn visible through the windows. "And with the market the way it is, its potential is just staggering. We think it's time to start thinking about modernizing its management, to really unlock its value." There it was, the first probe. The gentle, insidious suggestion that my home, my life's anchor, was nothing more than an underperforming asset on a balance sheet. "Modernizing?" I asked Lady Calmot, raising an eyebrow. "That sounds like a word a real estate developer would use." Her smile didn't falter. "I'm just thinking about you, Aurelia. And Edward, of course. After the wedding, you should be free to enjoy your golden years. Travel, relax, not worry about property taxes or a leaky roof. If we streamline the ownership now, put it in Edward's name. It's just a matter of dotting the I's and crossing the T's." It would be a weight off your shoulders. A weight off my shoulders. She spoke as if she were offering me a favor, a kindness, instead of demanding I surrender my entire world. I glanced at my son. He was staring into his glass, swirling the ice cubes, the picture of misery. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He couldn't. His shame was a physical presence in the room, suffocating the sweet gardenia-scented air. He had already sold his soul. Now he was here to collect the price. I knew he was weak, but I had never believed him to be cruel. This clumsy, transparent maneuver wasn't his design. It was all Clara, and the ruthless family standing behind her. My son wasn't a predator. He was the bait. I placed my teacup back on its saucer, the gentle clink echoing in the quiet room. "That's very thoughtful of you to consider my well-being, Clara," I said, my voice soft but laced with an unmistakable edge of iron. "But my shoulders are stronger than they look, and I find the weight of this house to be a rather pleasant burden. Ellison House isn't an asset to be streamlined. It's a heart, and it's still beating." The finality in my tone hung in the air. Clara's smile finally tightened, the first crack in her perfect facade. She had hit a wall she hadn't anticipated. She had mistaken age for weakness, politeness for submission. It was a common mistake people made when they met me. It was the mistake her entire plan was built on. She glanced at Edward, a flicker of command in her eyes, urging him to speak, to do his part. But he just sank deeper into the armchair, a man defeated. He mumbled something about having another appointment, and they were on their feet. I walked them to the door, maintaining the placid smile of a benevolent matriarch. Clara's goodbye was clipped. Edward's was a barely audible whisper. I stood on the wide, shaded veranda and watched them get into their gleaming silver Mercedes, a spaceship of a car that looked utterly alien parked on the gravel drive of my 19th century home. As they pulled away, spitting gravel from their tires, I watched until the car was nothing more than a silver glint on the long, oak-lined road. I didn't feel anger, not yet. I felt a profound, aching sorrow for the boy I had raised, now so lost and cornered that he would bring wolves to his own mother's door. But the sorrow was quickly hardening into resolve. He was a hostage, not a traitor, and a mother does not negotiate for her child. She goes to war. I turned, walked back into the quiet hall, and pulled my phone from the pocket of my dress. I scrolled to a single number, a name I hadn't called in months, but had kept ready for this exact moment. It rang twice before he picked up. "Samuel," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the emotion that had churned within me just moments before. "It's Aurelia." There was a pause on the other end, then his familiar, calm voice. "I was wondering when you'd call." "They were just here," I said, looking out the window at the empty drive. "The plan is in motion." The grandfather clock in the hall struck 10, each chime a heavy, resonant note in the otherwise silent house. I was in my late husband's study, a room that smelled of old leather, pipe tobacco, and paper. It was my sanctuary, the strategic heart of Ellison House, and tonight, it was a war room. The lamp on the mahogany desk cast a warm, isolated pool of light, leaving the rest of the room in deep shadow. Outside, the cicadas sang their relentless, buzzing chorus into the humid night. A discreet knock came at the French doors leading to the garden. It was Julian. I had told him to use this entrance, to avoid any staff who might still be awake. I unlatched the door and he slipped inside, bringing a gust of night air with him. In his crisp linen suit, he looked every bit the part of Charleston's most in-demand wedding planner. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm, the perfect prop for his visit. "The seating chart is a nightmare," he said, his voice a low murmur as he crossed the room. The Vanderbilts refused to be seated anywhere near the Beaumonts after that fiasco at the regatta. It was the perfect cover, Anyone listening would hear a stressed employee giving his client a late-night update. "We'll put them at opposite ends of the ballroom," I replied, playing my part. "Give them both a view of the stage. That should soothe their egos." He nodded, placing his portfolio on the desk. He unzipped it and pulled out a sheaf of papers, diagrams of the ballroom, lists of names, floral invoices. Tucked between the pages was a small black USB drive, no bigger than my thumbnail. He slid it across the polished wood towards me. His movements were fluid and economical, leaving no room for error. "And this," he said, his eyes meeting mine, "is the final guest confirmation. I think you'll want to review it personally. It changes things." I picked up the drive. It felt cold and heavy in my palm, a tiny vessel for a monstrous truth. "Thank you, Julian. I appreciate your diligence." "My father trusted you," he said simply. It was all the explanation he ever gave, and all I ever needed. My husband, Robert, had revealed Julian's existence to me a year before he passed. He was the result of a mistake made long before I was in the picture, a son Robert had supported quietly, from a distance. In his final years, Robert had brought him into our lives not as a son, but as a sworn protector, an ace up my sleeve that no one would ever see coming. Julian's loyalty wasn't to me, not really. It was to the father he barely knew, and the legacy he had been tasked to defend. "He was a good judge of character," I said. Julian gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then zipped his portfolio. "I'll see you at the rehearsal dinner. Try to look stressed about the seating chart." And with that, he was gone, melting back into the darkness of the garden as silently as he had arrived. I locked the door and returned to the desk, the USB drive clutched in my hand. For a moment, I just looked at it. I knew that whatever was on this drive would remove any last shred of hope that I was wrong, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. It was the point of no return. With a steady hand, I inserted it into my laptop. There was only one file on it, an audio recording. I put on my headphones, took a deep breath, and pressed play. The first voice was gravelly, impatient, and oozing with a sense of crude power. It was Franklin Whitmore, Clara's father. "The old woman is being stubborn," he growled. There were no pleasantries. Then I heard my son's voice, strained and thin. "She needs more time. This is her home, Dad. I mean, Franklin." A cruel laugh echoed through the headphones. "Don't call me Dad, son. You haven't earned that right yet. And we're out of time. My investors aren't patient men. You made a deal. You took our money to cover your pathetic little business failure, and now it's time to pay the piper." The deed to Ellison House, signed, sealed, and delivered the day after the wedding. "I'm trying," Edward pleaded, and the desperation in his voice was a physical blow. I closed my eyes, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the edge of the desk. "She's not just going to sign it over. She's smarter than you think." "Then you'd better get a hell of a lot smarter, boy," Whitmore snarled. The false friendliness was gone, replaced by pure venom. "Let me make this crystal clear. You don't get that signature. The wedding is off. And that debt you owe me, I won't just call it in. I will bury you with it. I'll make sure every bank, every investor, every friend you have from here to Savannah knows you're a fraud. I will ruin you. You will be a pariah. Your mother's precious family name will be dragged through the mud so thick it'll never come clean. Is that what you want?" There was a long, terrible silence. I could hear Edward's ragged breathing. I could feel his panic, his entrapment. He was caught in a snare of his own making, and the teeth were closing in. "No," he finally whispered. "I'll get it." "Good boy," Whitmore said, the condescending warmth returning to his voice. I knew you'd see it our way. Now, go be a good fiancé. Your future depends on it." The recording ended. I took off the headphones and sat in the profound silence of the study, the cicadas outside suddenly seeming loud and intrusive. There was no grief. The time for that had passed. The ache in my chest had cooled and hardened into something cold, dense, and heavy. It was the weight of certainty. The conversation confirmed everything: the threats, the leverage, the sheer brutal ugliness of their plan. They hadn't just targeted my home. They had targeted my son's weakness, his failures, his deep-seated fear of disappointing the Ellison name. They had turned him into a weapon against his own mother. But as the fury settled, a strange clarity emerged. My son wasn't a villain in this story. He wasn't a greedy, heartless traitor trying to steal his mother's home. He was a hostage, and I knew exactly what I had to do. The next morning, I drove to St. Michael's, a small Episcopal church tucked away on a quiet cobblestone street. It wasn't Sunday, and I wasn't there for a service. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of old wood and beeswax. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the empty pews in jewel-toned colors. This place wasn't just a house of God. It was a repository of secrets. Reverend Samuel Green was waiting for me in the front pew. He wasn't wearing his clerical collar. In his simple tweed jacket and slacks, he looked more like the history professor he'd once been than a retired man of the cloth. Samuel had been my husband's closest friend, his confidant, and, as it turned out, the executor of his most secret and final request. "Aurelia," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble that seemed to fit the sanctity of the space. He rose and gave my hands a gentle squeeze. His were warm and dry. "Samuel, thank you for meeting me," I said. "There's no need for thanks between us," he replied, his kind eyes searching my face. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not holding up, Samuel. I'm preparing," I said, and he nodded, a flicker of grim understanding in his expression. He knew this wasn't a social call. He led me not to the altar, but to a small private office behind the chancel. It was a simple room, lined with books on theology and local history. He went to a heavy oak cabinet, unlocked it with a small ornate key, and pulled out a handsome, dark-grained wooden box. It was Robert's old humidor, but I knew it hadn't held cigars for many years. He placed it on the desk between us. The air grew heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of the past and the gravity of the future. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the inheritance my husband had left me that wasn't listed in any will. "Robert asked me to give this to you only when you said the plan was in motion," Samuel said quietly. "He made me promise. He said you would know when the time was right, when the wolves were well and truly at the door." "They're not at the door anymore," I said, my gaze fixed on the box. "They're in the living room, measuring for new curtains." Samuel's lips thinned into a hard line. He slid the box towards me. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark green velvet, were two items. The first was a set of rolled-up schematics tied with a black ribbon. The second was a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with my husband's signet ring. My name was written on the front in his familiar, elegant script. I untied the ribbon and unrolled the papers. They were not blueprints for a house or a boat. They were detailed, technical drawings of the large crystal vase that was set to be the centerpiece on the head table at the wedding reception. Every facet, every curve was meticulously rendered. And there, circled in red ink, on a cross-section of the heavy base, was a small, hollowed-out compartment, perfectly sized to house a microchip. Below it, a note in Robert's handwriting. "The base is the heaviest part. It will be the last to break and the most likely to land intact. They'll go for the grandest object, a symbol of our family's wealth. Let them use it as their weapon. It was a Trojan horse made of crystal and flowers, a beautiful, elegant trap designed to be sprung by an act of violence. My husband had anticipated not just the threat, but the very nature of the enemy, their greed, their theatricality, their predictable brutality. My breath caught in my throat. After all this time, his brilliant strategic mind was still here, still protecting me. Then, I picked up the letter. My fingers broke the wax seal, and I unfolded the heavy pages. My dearest Aurelia, the letter began. If you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass. You are in a fight for everything we built. I am sorry to have left you to face this alone, but I did not leave you unarmed. You are the most formidable woman I have ever known, and I have no doubt you will see this through. The Whitmores, or someone like them, were always going to come for us. They are drawn to old families and old money like sharks to blood. They will see Edward's weakness not as a flaw to be mended, but as a door to be kicked in. They will use him. Do not hate our son for this. Pity him and then save him from himself. The plan we discussed is in this box. The vase is the key. It is a prop, a piece of stagecraft for the final act. Her anger will be her undoing. Let her throw it. Let her shatter it. Let her believe she is destroying you. In that moment of her supposed triumph, when she attacks you with a symbol of our legacy, she will in fact be activating its truest purpose, to record her own downfall. The chip is sound activated. It will capture everything. Samuel will help you. Julian will protect you. But you, my love, are the general. You must be the one to give the order. Be brave. Be ruthless. Defend our name. Yours always, Robert. I folded the letter, my eyes clear. The last vestiges of a wife's grief had been burned away, replaced by a warrior's resolve. I looked up at Samuel, who had been watching me, his expression full of concern. He believed you had the strength to see this through to the end, Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. Are you ready, Aurelia? I placed my hand on the smooth, cool wood of the box, over the schematics and the letter from the man I loved. My voice, when I spoke, was steady and firm, a vow made in the quiet of the old church. Samuel, I said, I've been ready since the day he left me. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. That evening, I found myself in the one room of the house that was more Robert's than mine. The archives. It wasn't a dusty, forgotten attic, but a meticulously organized library of our family's life. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held photo albums, leather-bound journals, and boxes of letters tied with faded ribbon. It was the physical memory of the Ellison family, a testament to the lives and loves that had echoed through these halls. I didn't turn on the main lights, preferring the soft glow of a single green-shaded lamp on Robert's old reading desk. I ran my hand along the back of his favorite leather armchair, the leather worn smooth and cool to the touch. I wasn't here to search for anything. I was here to remember, to connect with the man whose foresight was my greatest weapon. I settled into the chair, the familiar scent of old paper and cedar enveloping me like a hug. My mind drifted back to a conversation we'd had a few years before he passed, on a rainy afternoon much like this one. He had been looking out the window, watching the Spanish moss drip from the ancient oaks, his expression thoughtful. You know, he'd said, turning to me, a family like ours doesn't just accumulate land and money, Aurelia. We accumulate enemies. It's the tax on a long and prosperous life. That's a cheerful thought, my dear, I had replied, looking up from my book. He smiled, a sad, wise smile. It's a realistic one, and the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones who storm the gates. They're the ones you invite in for tea, the ones who smile at you while measuring the dimensions of your coffin. His words had chilled me then. Now, they felt like a prophecy fulfilled. I remembered setting my book aside, giving him my full attention. "What do we do when they come, Robert?" I had asked. "We don't flinch," he answered, his eyes intense, "and we remember what our true legacy is. It's not this house. It's not the money. Those are just things. Our legacy is our name, our honor, and sometimes to protect that honor, you have to be willing to let the material things burn." He had walked over to a glass display case where a few cherished family heirlooms were kept. A Civil War saber, my great-grandmother's locket, a first edition book of poetry. He didn't look at any of them. "I've been thinking about our final family heirloom," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The most valuable one of all." "And what's that?" I asked, intrigued. "I thought I knew them all by heart." "This one is different," he said, tapping his temple. "It's an idea. It's a fail-safe. It's a story that says the Ellison family's greatest treasure is not a thing to be possessed, but a truth to be revealed. And its value is only unlocked when it's destroyed by hatred." I had been confused. "Destroyed? Robert, what are you talking about?" "Think of it, Aurelia," he said, his eyes gleaming with the intellectual fire I had always loved. "An object of great beauty, a symbol of our prosperity. An enemy, blinded by greed, tries to shatter it, to shatter us. But they don't realize the object is a vessel. Its destruction isn't the end. It's the catalyst. It's designed to break in a very specific way. And from its ashes, from the very act of its ruin, the truth is reborn. The enemy's violence becomes the very key that exposes them." Sitting there in the quiet archives, his words echoed not as a strange philosophical riddle, but as a clear and precise battle plan. The vase, the chip, Clara's predictable, theatrical rage. It was all there. He had seen the writing on the wall years ago. He hadn't just been preparing for a fight. He had been choreographing the victory. He had armed me not with a weapon of defense, but with a script for a play in which my enemy was the unwitting star, destined to play the part of the villain who brings about her own destruction. A wave of profound gratitude washed over me, so powerful it left me breathless. There was no room for sorrow, no space for self-pity. How could I feel alone when his presence, his love, and his brilliant strategy were so vividly alive all around me? He had trusted me to be the director of his final, masterful performance. I rose from the chair, feeling lighter than I had in days. The weight on my shoulders wasn't a burden. It was a mantle I had been trained to wear. I ran my fingers over the spine of his journal, a silent thank you that transcended the veil between life and death. I walked out of the archives and closed the door softly behind me, leaving the ghosts and memories to their slumber. I had what I came for. Not a clue or an object, but a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet, unshakable confidence. As I walked down the grand staircase, my hand gliding along the polished banister, a small, genuine smile touched my lips. The stage was set. The actors were in place, and I, the director, was ready for the curtain to rise. The Whitmore mansion was less a home and more a monument to aggressive wealth. Perched on a newly developed stretch of coastline, it was a sprawling, white-stuccoed beast of a house, all sharp angles and vast expanses of glass. Inside, the decor was a chaotic symphony of the ostentatious. Gilded furniture crowded every room, modern art that looked more like a crime scene than a canvas hung on the walls. And the air conditioning was cranked so high it felt like walking into a meat locker. It was the complete antithesis of Ellison House's quiet, lived-in grace. It was a house built to intimidate, not to welcome. The rehearsal dinner was an equally cold affair. About 30 of us were seated around a comically long glass table, so wide you had to raise your voice to speak to the person opposite you. Franklin Whitmore sat at the head, holding court like a petty king, his booming laughter echoing off the marble floors. I was seated between Edward's aunt and one of Clara's cousins, a young woman with a vacant expression and a diamond necklace that could probably pay off a small country's national debt. Across the table, Clara was glowing. On her home turf, surrounded by her family's gaudy trophies, she was in her element. She kept shooting me little triumphant glances, as if my very presence in her palace was a concession of defeat. She had no idea I was a spy deep in enemy territory, gathering my final pieces of intelligence before the battle. The main course had just been cleared when Clara decided it was time to strike. She tapped her champagne flute with a manicured nail, a high-pitched ping that drew all eyes to her. "I was just thinking," she began, her voice syrupy sweet, "how wonderful it is that Aurelia could join us tonight. It must be so overwhelming, all this modernity." She gestured around the room, a sweeping motion that encompassed the sterile white walls and the garish chandelier that looked like a crystal octopus. "I know you prefer a more traditional aesthetic, Aurelia," she continued, her eyes zeroing in on my simple navy blue dress. "I was telling Edward just the other day, we absolutely must take you shopping after the honeymoon. Get you into something a little more contemporary. My treat, of course." The insult, wrapped in a pretty bow of feigned generosity, landed on the table with a thud. A few of the Whitmore relatives tittered. My own family members looked down at their plates, embarrassed. Edward stared at his water glass, his jaw tight. He was a spectator at his own execution. I simply smiled, a serene, patient expression I had perfected over decades of dealing with impertinent fools at university faculty meetings. I didn't say a word. I let her think she had scored a point. Emboldened by my silence, she pressed on. "And your home. It has such history, but it's so quiet. Don't you get lonely? I told Edward, once we're married, we'll bring some life back to the place. Parties, fundraisers, a whole new guest list. We'll bring Ellison House into the 21st century." This was her true goal, laid bare for all to see. Not just to possess the house, but to erase me from it, to scrub away the legacy I represented and replace it with her own loud, shallow version of success. She wasn't just attacking my taste, she was attacking my very existence. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water. I carefully placed the glass back on the table, making sure the coaster was perfectly aligned. The silence at the table stretched, becoming tense and uncomfortable. All eyes were on me, waiting for my reaction. They expected me to be flustered, to stammer a weak defense, to shrink under the bright, harsh lights of the Whitmore dining room. Finally, I dabbed the corners of my mouth with my napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it in my lap. I looked directly at Clara, my smile never wavering. "That's very kind of you to offer, my dear," I began, my voice calm and measured, yet carrying a clarity that cut through the room's tense atmosphere. "But I've always found that simplicity is a luxury that money can't buy. It's a form of elegance that doesn't need to announce itself with a price tag." I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "You see, there's a difference between being rich and being wealthy. Anyone can be rich. It just requires a certain ruthlessness. But wealth, true wealth, is something that's passed down. It's in the stories a house can tell, in the honor of a family name, in a person's character." My gaze swept from Clara to her father, then back to her. "Some things in this world can only be inherited through dignity, Clara," I finished, my voice dropping to a soft, almost gentle tone. "And that, my dear girl, is a piece of jewelry you will never be able to wear." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Franklin Whitmore's jovial mask had dropped, replaced by a scowl. Clara's face was a storm of fury. Her cheeks flushed a blotchy, unattractive red. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, utterly disarmed. She had come at me with a club, and I had disemboweled her with a scalpel. I had won. This wasn't just a victory of words, it was a strategic success. I had publicly exposed her crude ambition and, more importantly, I had stoked the fire of her rage. I had planted a seed of humiliation that I knew would blossom into the blind, reckless fury I needed for the final act. I pushed my chair back slightly. "If you'll excuse me," I said to the table at large. "It's been a long day." As I walked out of that cold, cavernous room, I could feel Clara's hateful stare burning into my back. It was a satisfying warmth. The first round was over, and she had no idea she had just been played. The night before my son's wedding, Ellison House was quieter than a tomb. A soft, silver moonlight filtered through the tall windows of my bedroom, tracing the patterns of the lace curtains on the hardwood floor. Outside, the world seemed to be holding its breath. There was no wind, and even the ever-present chorus of the cicadas had fallen silent. It was the deepest, most profound kind of quiet, the calm before the storm. Any other mother in my position would have been sleepless, I imagine. Tossing and turning, her mind a maelstrom of last-minute worries, sentimental memories, and a gnawing dread for the day to come. But I was not tossing and turning. I was sitting propped up against a mountain of pillows in my bed, perfectly still, the cool blue-white light of a tablet illuminating my face. I was not feeling sentimental. I was not worried. I was working. On the screen was the final operational blueprint, sent by Julian an hour earlier under the guise of a final vendor confirmation. It was a detailed schematic of the Charleston Grand's ballroom. To the casual observer, it was just a floor plan. To me, it was a battlefield. My finger traced the lines on the screen, a general reviewing her attack plan one last time. There was the head table, marked with a prominent X. I zoomed in. A smaller red circle indicated the precise placement of the crystal vase. It was positioned at the exact center, equidistant from both Clara and Edward, but directly in her line of sight to me on the stage. It was an irresistible target. Then I swiped to the next file. It was a feed from the hotel's security network, which Julian's AV technician had discreetly gained access to. Little green dots pulsed from the corners of the room, indicating the locations of the hidden cameras he had installed. They weren't just standard security cameras. These were high definition, with audio capturing capabilities, focused on the key players. One was aimed directly at the head table, another on the stage where I would stand, and a third on Franklin Whitmore's table. There would be no ambiguity, no he said, she said. There would only be irrefutable, multi-angle proof. I spent a long time studying the angles, imagining the scene unfolding. I saw Clara's face contorting in rage. I saw the vase leaving her hands. I saw the reactions of the guests. I saw it all. Not as a future possibility, but as a scene I had already watched a dozen times. The final document was a timeline, broken down into 5-minute increments. It was the script for our counterattack. 7:30 in the evening, Aurelia Ellison begins toast. Approximately 7:35 in the evening, verbal provocation delivered. Projected at 7:40 in the evening, the incident. Vase is thrown. 7:40 in the evening, plus 30 seconds. Julian signals security team, Alpha and Beta. Team moves to secure the asset, Vase base with chip, under the guise of cleanup. 7:45 in the evening, ballroom power cut. Main grid and backup generator plunged to black. 7:45 in the evening. Plus 15 seconds. Stage screen and speakers activated on independent power source. Video and audio evidence presented by attorney Jonathan Hale. 7:50 in the evening. Stage lights activate. Julian takes the stage to deliver the final blow. It was all there. Every step, every contingency. We had dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. There was no room for error, no space for chance. The Whitmores thought they were playing a game of chess, but they didn't realize I was the one who had designed the board and written the rules. I felt a profound sense of calm settle over me, a cold, clear certainty that left no room for fear or doubt. I was not a victim preparing to be humiliated. I was not a mother grieving the loss of her son to a terrible woman. Those emotions belonged to a different story, a different Aurelia. Tonight, I was a director, a showrunner, on the eve of my premiere. I had overseen the script. I had managed the actors. I had checked the lighting and the props. All that was left was for the curtain to rise and for the star of the show to deliver the performance of a lifetime. Clara, in her rage and greed, would not disappoint. She would hit her mark with spectacular self-destructive precision. I powered down the tablet and set it on the nightstand. The room returned to the soft, silvery light of the moon. I looked out the window, at the dark, sleeping shapes of the ancient oaks that stood guard over my home. They had witnessed generations of Ellisons live, love, and fight for this land. Tomorrow, I would honor that legacy. I was not preparing to be shamed. I was preparing to bring down the house. The world exploded in a starburst of pain and light. For a split second, the only sound was the sharp, percussive crack of crystal against bone, followed by the wet splash of water across my skin. Then the chaos erupted. A single, collective gasp from 300 people, followed by a tidal wave of screams. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry out. My body absorbed the shock, a jarring impact that sent a tremor down my spine. But my mind remained a pocket of absolute stillness in the heart of the hurricane. I felt the cold water from the vase run down my neck, followed by the slow, warm, and distinctly sticky trickle of my own blood from a cut above my eye. The pain was a dull, persistent throb, an inconvenience, nothing more. It was the price of admission for the show that was about to begin. Through a film of water and a slight ringing in my ears, I saw the scene before me as if it were a painting. My son, Edward, stood frozen, his face a mask of chalk-white horror, his mouth agape. He was a statue of impotence. And Clara? Oh, Clara. She was magnificent in her fury. Her chest was heaving, her expensive wedding dress slightly askew, and her face was flushed with the intoxicating thrill of her own violence. A triumphant, feral smile played on her lips. She had done it. In front of everyone, she had struck down the old queen. She thought she had just won the kingdom, but I wasn't looking at her. My eyes, clear and steady despite the blood beginning to cloud my vision, scanned the room and found Julian. He was already in motion, a study of calm efficiency amidst the bedlam. Guests were surging to their feet, knocking over chairs. Hotel staff were running towards the stage, their faces a mixture of panic and confusion. But Julian's focus was elsewhere. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second. It was all we needed. I held his gaze, a silent command passing between us. Now, he gave a sharp, almost invisible jerk of his head towards two men standing near the ballroom's main exit. They were dressed in the standard black suits of hotel security, but they didn't work for the hotel. They worked for me. They were Alpha and Beta. As the crowd's attention focused entirely on me, the bleeding matriarch on the stage, Alpha and Beta, began to move. but they didn't move towards me. Their path was completely counterintuitive to the unfolding drama. They walked briskly, with purpose, not to the victim, but to the scene of the crime. The glittering field of crystal shards spread across the stage floor. Clara, lost in her adrenaline-fueled victory lap, didn't see them. Edward, dead to the world in his shock, saw nothing. But I saw everything. With the fluid precision of a practice team, they reached the debris. Alpha knelt, pulling a pair of black latex gloves from his pocket and snapping them on. He ignored the larger, more obvious pieces of the shattered vase. His eyes scanned the wreckage for one specific piece, the heavy, solid base. It had landed near the edge of the stage, miraculously intact. Beta stood over him, his broad shoulders creating a subtle screen, his body language suggesting he was simply securing the area. It was a masterful piece of misdirection. While dozens of people were trying to get onto the stage to help me, Alpha and Beta were focused on the real prize. With a surgeon's care, Alpha picked up the crystal base. He held it for a moment, turning it over in his gloved hand. I knew what he was looking for. The tiny, almost invisible glint of the microchip, now activated and recording every panicked shout, every horrified whisper in the room. He gave a slight nod. The asset was secure. He wrapped it carefully in a black cloth he produced from another pocket, stood up, and the two of them melted back towards the exit, their movements so seamless they were practically invisible in the swirling chaos. The entire operation had taken less than 30 seconds. A woman I didn't know was dabbing at my forehead with a linen napkin, murmuring, "Oh, you poor dear. You poor dear woman." I let her fuss over me, playing the part of the frail, elderly victim. I allowed my shoulders to slump slightly. I let a tremor enter my hand as I raised it to my temple. The performance had to be perfect on all fronts, but inside, my mind was a steel trap. The trap is sprung. The bait is taken. The evidence is secured. I looked at Clara again. Her initial triumph was beginning to curdle into a smug sense of justification. She was already crafting the narrative in her head. The old woman had provoked her, had pushed her too far. She was the real victim here. Her father, Franklin Whitmore, was making his way towards the stage, his face a mask of faux concern. But I could see the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. They thought the game was over. They had no idea that the clock had just started ticking. 5 minutes. That was the timeline, from the moment of impact to the moment of retribution. As the hotel manager finally reached me, babbling apologies and calling for a medic, I glanced at the small, discreet watch on my wrist. 4 minutes and 30 seconds to go. Just as the hotel manager was attempting to lead me off the stage, my 5 minutes were up. On cue, the world went black. It wasn't a flicker. It was a sudden, absolute, and total void. The magnificent chandeliers died with a soft pop. The wall sconces vanished. The emergency lights failed to kick in. Every source of light in the grand ballroom was extinguished, plunging 300 of Charleston's most powerful people into a disorienting, primordial darkness. The reaction was immediate. The low hum of panic that had been simmering in the room instantly boiled over. Women shrieked. A man shouted in anger. The air filled with the sound of scraping chairs and stumbling feet as people, blinded and confused, tried to make sense of the void. The chaos that had been a spectacle just moments before now became a shared, claustrophobic terror. "What in God's name is going on?" someone yelled near the front. "It's a power failure," another voice answered, thin and unconvincing. In the confusion, I felt a firm but gentle hand on my elbow. It was Julian, guiding me discreetly to a small, curtained-off alcove at the side of the stage. A small first aid kit was waiting on a chair. As he quickly and efficiently applied a butterfly bandage to the cut on my forehead, my eyes remained fixed on the center of the room. This was my favorite part. Then, through the darkness, a new light appeared. It wasn't the warm golden glow of the chandeliers. It was the cold electronic blue of the massive projection screen behind the stage. It flickered to life, a luminous rectangle in the oppressive dark, instantly drawing every eye in the room. The murmuring died down, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. They were probably expecting a hotel logo or a technical difficulties message. They were wrong. There was no wedding photo. Instead, an image appeared, grainy at first, then sharpening into crystal clarity. It was a sterile, modern office, the kind with glass walls and a view of the city. Two men were seated at a large desk. The third was standing over them. The angle was from a corner of the room, slightly elevated. A hidden camera. A collective gasp rippled through the darkness. The figures were unmistakable. Franklin Whitmore and his son were on one side of the desk. And standing before them, looking pale and defeated, was my son, Edward. The video had no sound, but it didn't need it. The body language told the entire story. Franklin was leaning forward, his face a mask of predatory aggression, a thick finger jabbing at a document on the desk. Edward was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, the picture of a man being crushed by an invisible weight. Then, as the silent, damning scene played out, the ballroom's powerful sound system crackled to life. But it wasn't music. It was a voice. Franklin Whitmore's voice, amplified to fill every corner of the vast, dark room. It was the recording Julian had given me. "My investors aren't patient men," his voice boomed, dripping with menace. "You made a deal. You took our money to cover your pathetic little business failure. And now it's time to pay the piper." The deed to Ellison House, signed, sealed, and delivered the day after the wedding. The audience was dead silent, a room full of ghosts held captive by a disembodied voice. They were no longer just guests at a wedding. They were a jury. Then came my son's voice, thin and desperate, a lamb pleading with the butcher. "I'm trying. She's not just going to sign it over. She's smarter than you think." Franklin's cruel recorded laughter echoed through the ballroom, a sound of pure, unadulterated evil. "Then you'd better get a hell of a lot smarter, boy. I will ruin you. You will be a pariah. Your mother's precious family name will be dragged through the mud so thick it'll never come clean. Is that what you want?" On the screen, the silent movie continued its grim ballet. Franklin pushed the papers and a pen towards Edward. My son, his face a portrait of utter despair, picked up the pen. His hand trembled. "No," his recorded voice whispered through the speakers, a sound of complete surrender. "I'll get it." The video ended. The screen went black. The audio cut out. The darkness and the silence that followed were heavier, more profound than before. It was a silence filled with judgment and disgust. The Whitmores hadn't just been exposed. They had been vivisected in front of the very society they were so desperate to conquer. Then, with a sudden, jarring snap, the stage lights blazed to life, blindingly bright. Standing center stage, in the full glare of the spotlights, was a man who had not been there before. He was tall, silver-haired, and wore a perfectly tailored suit like a suit of armor. He held a microphone in one hand and a leather-bound folder in the other. He radiated an aura of unshakable authority. It was Jonathan Hale, my late husband's lawyer and the most feared litigator in the state of South Carolina. A new wave of gasps, this time of recognition, swept the room. The Whitmore family, caught in the sudden glare, looked like panicked animals frozen in the headlights of an oncoming truck. Clara was trembling uncontrollably, her face ashen, her eyes darting from the empty screen to her father's horrified face. From my vantage point in the shadows, my wound neatly bandaged, I watched it all. The hunter's trap had closed, and the wolves were finally, irrevocably caught. Jonathan Hale let the silence hang in the air for a long, punishing moment. He stood in the spotlight, a figure of pure, unassailable authority, and surveyed the wreckage of the Whitmore family. They were pinned by the glare, exposed and pathetic. "For those of you who may be unclear," he began, his voice like the crack of a glacier, cold and final, "what you have just witnessed is evidence of a criminal conspiracy. The charges will include, but are not limited to, extortion, coercion, and conspiracy to commit felony fraud." He paused, letting the legal terms, each one a nail in their coffin, land with devastating weight. The Charleston District Attorney's Office takes a very dim view of such matters, especially when they involve elder abuse. A fresh wave of horrified murmurs swept through the unseen crowd. The Whitmores were no longer just social outcasts. They were criminals. Franklin Whitmore's face had turned a mottled purplish color, a man drowning on dry land. Clara, however, seemed to be rallying, a cornered animal preparing for one last, desperate lunge. Her eyes, wild with fury, darted around the room, searching for a way out. An excuse, a lie that could somehow salvage this catastrophe. "This is a lie, a setup," she shrieked, her voice raw and ragged. "That recording is fake. That old woman is a manipulative witch who—" Her tirade was cut short. A new figure stepped out of the shadows and into the light beside Jonathan Hale. It was Julian. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his face calm, his posture relaxed. He took the second microphone from the stand. Clara's eyes widened, a flicker of hope in their depths. Julian, her co-conspirator, the stylish, slightly vapid wedding planner she had so easily charmed, the one she had confided in, the one who had agreed that the old woman was a relic who needed to be put out to pasture. He would defend her. He would expose this as a trick. "It's true," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at him. "Tell them, Julian. Tell them how she's been plotting against me." Julian looked at her, and for the first time, she must have seen past the fashionable haircut and the designer suit. She must have seen the cool, assessing intelligence in his eyes, the look of a man she didn't know at all. He raised the microphone to his lips. "My name," he said, his voice clear and steady, resonating through the silent ballroom, "is Julian Ellison." If the audio recording had been a bomb, this was the aftershock that leveled what was left of the city. The name, Ellison, hung in the air, an impossible, incomprehensible fact. I saw my sister-in-law's hand fly to her mouth. I heard a dozen confused whispers of, "Who?" and "What did he say?" But Clara understood. I watched the comprehension dawn on her face, a slow, sickening wave of realization that was more devastating than any physical blow. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a waxy, translucent white. Her ally, her confidant, the man she had trusted with every detail of her vile little plan. He was one of them. "I am Robert Ellison's son," Julian continued, his voice devoid of emotion, as if he were reading from a ledger. "And for the past 6 months, at my father's request, I have had the distinct displeasure of being Clara Whitmore's closest confidant." He looked down at her, his expression not one of anger, but of a kind of clinical contempt. She was quite forthcoming. She believed she had found a kindred spirit, someone who also saw my stepmother as an obstacle to be managed. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He swiped the screen, and a new image appeared on the giant projection screen behind him, a screenshot of a text message conversation. "For example," Julian said, his voice a cool counterpoint to the damning words now glowing for all to see. "This is from last Tuesday, and I quote, 'The old bat is tougher than she looks. Had to lay it on thick about wanting to take care of her. She almost bought it. LOL. He swiped again. Another screenshot. Or this one, regarding the wedding gift she expected. Quote, "Forget the china. I want the deed. That house is a gold mine, and I plan on digging." He didn't need to continue. The evidence was absolute, the betrayal complete. This wasn't just a failed hostile takeover. This was a public humiliation of the highest order, orchestrated by the very person she thought was her pawn. She had been played, from the very first moment, by the master's son. It was the final blow, the last thread of her composure, her arrogance, her entire world, just snapped. A terrible guttural sound escaped her throat, a noise of pure animal despair. Her eyes, which had been filled with fire just moments before, were now vacant, staring into the abyss of her own ruin. She didn't faint. She collapsed. Her body just gave out, folding in on itself like a discarded marionette whose strings had been cut. She crumpled to the floor of the stage in a heap of white silk and shattered dreams. A pathetic, broken thing. The grand conspiracy, the ambitious power play, the entire Whitmore dynasty's social climbing, all of it ended right there. Not with a bang, but with a whimper, in a silent ballroom, under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the truth. I didn't stay to watch the aftermath. I had no interest in seeing the Whitmores being escorted out by security, or in accepting the shocked apologies and fawning compliments of the remaining guests. The play was over. The curtain had fallen. My work in the ballroom was done. I slipped out through a side door and found myself in a quiet, manicured garden behind the hotel. The cool night air was a balm on my skin, a welcome relief from the overheated drama inside. A full moon hung in the inky sky, casting long, skeletal shadows from the crepe myrtle trees. The only sound was the gentle splash of a nearby fountain and the distant, muted chaos of the party I had just destroyed. I walked to a stone bench and sat, the adrenaline that had sustained me for the past hour finally beginning to recede, leaving a profound weariness in its place. I had won. I had saved my home, defended my husband's legacy, and exposed our enemies. But the victory felt hollow, the triumph tainted by a deep, aching sadness for the son I had been forced to sacrifice in the process. I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me, hesitant and shuffling. I didn't need to turn around. I knew who it was. Edward stopped a few feet away from the bench. He didn't speak. I could hear his ragged, hitching breaths. He stood there for a long moment, a silhouette of shame against the moonlight. Then, with a choked gom, he fell to his knees on the gravel. "Mom," he whispered, the word a broken, pathetic thing. "Mom, I'm so sorry." His shoulders shook with violent, racking sobs. He knelt there in his expensive, ruined tuxedo, a grown man weeping like a lost child. My first instinct, the primal maternal urge that had driven me for 40 years, was to go to him, to pull him up, to hold him and tell him everything would be all right. But I didn't move. I remained on the bench, my hands clasped in my lap, and I watched him. This was a pain he had to feel. This was a rock bottom he had to hit, and I would not soften the landing. "I was a coward," he cried, his voice muffled as he buried his face in his hands. "A weak, pathetic coward. I let them use me. I was going to let them take our home, your home. I'm so sorry." He looked up at me then, his face streaked with tears, his eyes pleading. "Please, Mom, forgive me, please." I looked into his eyes, the same eyes I had looked into the day he was born, and my heart broke. But the love that remained was no longer the soft, yielding, unconditional love of his childhood. It had been forged in the fire of this crisis into something harder, something stronger. It was the love of a savior, not just a mother. And sometimes, salvation is a severe and terrible thing. "No, Edward," I said, my voice quiet but clear, carrying across the space between us with absolute finality. He flinched as if I had struck him. "What?" "I cannot forgive you," I repeated, my voice unwavering. I did not raise him from the ground. I did not offer him a hand. I offered him only the hard, unvarnished truth. My forgiveness is worthless to you right now. It would be a bandage on a mortal wound, a lie we would both have to live with for the rest of our lives. It would make you feel better for a night, but it would leave you just as weak as you were this morning. He stared at me, confusion warring with his despair. "I don't understand." "This isn't about me, Edward," I said, leaning forward slightly. "This isn't about the pain you caused me or the risk you put our family in. This is about you. You are the one who has to live with the choices you made. You are the one who has to look at himself in the mirror every morning." I stood up and walked to him, but I didn't kneel. I stood over him, forcing him to look up at me from his place of shame. "I cannot give you absolution. You have to earn it," I said, my voice stern, but laced with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "You have to forgive yourself, and the only way you can do that is by building a life of integrity, by becoming a man your father would have been proud of, a man you can be proud of." I reached down, but not to help him up. I gently touched his cheek, my fingers brushing away a tear. "Go," I said softly. "Leave Charleston. Leave the Ellison name and the money and the expectations behind. Go somewhere no one knows you. Get a job. Work with your hands. Build something. Fail. Get up and build it again. Find out who Edward is, without the safety net of being an Ellison." His eyes widened, a flicker of terror in them. But beneath the terror, I saw a tiny, nascent spark of something else. Not hope, not yet, but a possibility, a path out of the prison of his own weakness. "Go," I repeated, my voice firm. "And do not come back. Do not call me. Do not write me. Do not come back until you have found the man you were meant to be. The day you can look me in the eye, not as a son asking for forgiveness, but as an equal asking for respect. That is the day you will be welcome home." I took my hand away and stepped back. He stayed there on his knees for another moment, the weight of my words settling upon him. Then, slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. He didn't say another word. He just looked at me, a long, searching look, and then he turned and walked away, his footsteps crunching on the gravel until he was swallowed by the darkness. I stood alone by the fountain, listening until the sound of his footsteps was gone, leaving only the gentle splash of the water and the beating of my own heavy heart. 6 months later, the scent of magnolias still hung in the air at Ellison House, but it was different now. It mingled with the aroma of fresh coffee, the murmur of conversation, and the faint, pleasant echo of children's laughter from the gardens. The old, sacred quiet of the house was gone, replaced by the vibrant, gentle hum of new life. The iron gates, once closed to the world, now stood permanently open. A simple, elegant brass plaque next to the front door read, "The Ellison Legacy Foundation, dedicated to rebuilding with integrity." Ellison House was no longer my private fortress. It was a public trust, a sanctuary. After the dust from the wedding had settled, after the Whitmore empire had crumbled under the weight of lawsuits and public disgrace, and Clara had retreated into a self-imposed, humiliated exile, Samuel, Julian, and I had found ourselves with a choice. We could retreat, lock the gates, and return to the quiet life we had once known. or we could honor the true spirit of Robert's plan. We chose the latter. The ground floor of the house had been converted into a series of galleries, showcasing the work of young, local artists. The grand ballroom, once the stage for my humiliation and triumph, now hosted fundraisers and workshops for a cause very close to my heart, providing legal aid and seed capital for young entrepreneurs who had been defrauded by predatory investors, just as my son had been. The gardens were open to the public from dawn until dusk, a quiet place for people to walk, to think, to find a moment of peace in the heart of the city. I stood on the second-floor balcony, the same one my husband and I had stood on for countless evenings, and looked down at the scene below. A young couple was having a picnic on the lawn. A group of students were sketching the rose bushes. Reverend Samuel was leading a small tour group along the riverbank path, his deep voice carrying on the gentle breeze. Julian was standing near the entrance, deep in conversation with a nervous-looking young woman, a folder of business plans tucked under her arm. He looked at her with a kind, encouraging expression that was all his father. He had finally found his place, not in the shadows, but as a proud public face of the Ellison name. We had taken a legacy built on land and money and transformed it into one built on second chances. We had taken a symbol of exclusive, old-world power and turned it into a source of community and hope. A member of the foundation staff, a bright young woman named Sarah, stepped out onto the balcony. "Mrs. Ellison, the afternoon mail is here." She handed me a small stack of letters, bills, invitations to charity events, letters from artists. But at the bottom of the pile was a single, simple postcard. It was plain, a little worn from its journey. The picture on the front was of a rustic, sun-drenched workshop. Sawdust covered the floor, and tools hung neatly on the walls. In the center of the room was a simple, sturdy-looking wooden table, clearly unfinished. There was no address, no name, just a postmark from a small, unfamiliar town in Oregon. I turned it over. On the back, there were only 10 words, written in a familiar, slightly clumsy handwriting that I hadn't seen since my son was a boy, riding home from summer camp. "I'm building my first table. Thank you, Mom." There was no signature. None was needed. I stood there on the balcony, the postcard in my hand, and a profound, quiet peace settled over me, deeper and more complete than any I had ever known. The ache in my heart for the son I had lost was finally gone, replaced by a swelling pride for the man he was becoming. He wasn't just building a table. He was building a life. He was rebuilding himself, piece by piece, with his own 2 hands. He was earning his own forgiveness, far from the shadows of his family name. I looked out over the gardens, at the people enjoying the legacy we had created. My husband had been right. The house, the money, they were just things. They could be taken. The true legacy was honor. It was the ability to take something broken and make it whole again, to take a story of betrayal and pain and turn it into one of redemption. I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. The Ellison legacy hadn't been destroyed that night at the wedding. It hadn't even been saved. It had been reborn. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.